Good morning. And those of you who are regulars, you might have noticed I've been kind of missing in action for the summer. I was taking a bit of a step back, a bit tired after 7 years of this, and also there's just a ton of stuff to take care of behind the scenes. So I'm really thankful that there's a team able to support me in that and give the space to make that possible. But we're back in action this morning. So today, we're back in the Gospel of Matthew. We're back in his telling of the extraordinary story of Jesus. And we're looking at a key moment. And the one we're going to look at today is extraordinary even in Jesus' extraordinary life. But before we get onto the story, I want us to remember what's going on around, what the kind of mood music is in the background. See, who here has been on a road trip? Who's done a road trip? Anyone done a nice long road? Yep, well done, road trippers. A multi-day journey to get somewhere. My family, a few summers back, we took an amazing trip around Europe, around Northern Europe. And one of the things every road trip really needs is a playlist, a backing track, right? A mixtape if you're an oldie. And we ended up with a shared playlist for our trip, and we had some rules. Obviously, you have to have some rules about how to make up these sorts of lists. You have a rule about how many tracks each person can add, how much of Ian's Midwestern emo gets to dominate with its shoutiness, how much of Liz's Eurovision obsession shapes our journey, how much of Cameron's shouty ska punk shows up, and how much of my country. Yes, going through a country phase. It's just one of those things that's happening. Well, Jesus is, at this point in his scriptures, he's taking his followers on a road trip. And of course, there is no car, and he's often going places where there isn't even a road, so it's more of a path trip, really. It's a slightly different thing. And although there's no shared playlist on this road trip, what there is there's a sort of mood music on in the background. There's a sort of tone, there's a sort of vibe for the journey that he's been developing through the conversations along the way. And for this part of the journey, Jesus is really kind of dominating the music selection. It's like there's just one type of music in there, just one person slipping a few too many tracks from their favorite band into the playlist. You see, Jesus keeps on putting in suffering and death songs. Suffering and death songs. From that time on, you see this? From that time on, Jesus began to explain these things. He's doing it again and again. And that is not what the disciples want to listen to. That's not the vibe they're going for, and so they're really happy to tell Jesus they're not into that. They show him they're not into this vibe, but Jesus is like, all the same, this is what's going into the playlist. And even after today's passage, you get the same thing again. Jesus keeps on his suffering and death all the way. When they come together in Galilee after this, he says the Son of Man's going to be delivered into the hands of men. They'll kill him. This is the mood music. This is what's in the background as we come to today's passage. And Jesus today takes his innermost 3 followers, his closest companions, off on a special side trip. So with that in mind now, we're going to listen together to this extraordinary story, and we're going to see what we can learn from it. And Liz is going to read for us today. Now we're taking on Matthew chapter 17, which is page 984, if you want to find that. Matthew chapter 17, page 984.
After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist.
Thanks very much, Liz. Now, as we get started, we need to be honest. This is a pretty weird story. If you're new to church or just exploring with us, it probably sounds pretty far out there. Really, you've got a glowing Jesus. You've got two of the key characters, standouts from Jewish history, Moses and Elijah, just showing up out of nowhere. You've got a self-propelled cloud, a disembodied voice. That is just quite a lot of weird to pack into one story. Now, it's clearly an extraordinary event, and it's clearly important. It's recorded for us in 3 out of the 4 Gospels, in Luke and Mark's Gospels, 2 parallel accounts of the life of Jesus. I guess it is the sort of thing that would stick with you, right? If you experience that. And it would be a really odd thing to make up, right? This would be a really odd thing to make up. If you were one of those disciples, would you really make up such a wild story? Would you make up a story that shows you in such a negative light? You know, Peter's motor mouth has to be interrupted by God himself. It's like very odd to make this. It's a weird story. It raises a lot of questions. But one of the things we've said here before, and we have to say it again today, is the Bible doesn't tell us everything we want to know. It tells us everything we need to know. So as it raises lots of questions for us, it doesn't actually answer all of them for us. Let's see what we can figure out, though. Okay, so what is going on with the glowing Jesus? Well, there are various theories, really, but it's not explained. Is this the glory of God that is hidden under the skin of Jesus, kind of shining out? Is this the glory of the world to come, breaking into the present? Is this Jesus literally being the light of the world in a very kind of practical, physical sense? Well, we don't really know, but certainly it marks him out as extraordinary. And what about those 2 characters who show up meeting with Jesus? Well, Moses is right at the top of the Jewish Hall of Fame. If you heard of the 10 plagues, the Exodus, the 10 commandments, all of that is on his watch. He's a Jewish child who was raised as a prince in the ruling home of Egypt, and one who God calls out of that to lead his people out of Egypt through the middle of the sea into the promised land. So Moses, the Bible tells us, speaks to God face to face as a man speaks to his friend. So it kind of makes sense, actually. If anyone was going to be here, it'd be Moses. Elijah is another one from the Jewish Hall of Fame. He's a key prophet in the middle of amazing stories. If you want to read kind of the superhero novel part of the Bible, go for Elijah's life, because it's all like superpowers all the time. That's really exciting. But there are various theories about why it's these 2 rather than any of the other key figures who could show up. But if you think about it, there are quite a lot of other people who could have been here. I mean, what about Father Abraham, who had many sons? Wouldn't that be a good one to show up here? Or King David, the high point of Israel's life? Or Daniel, the extraordinary prophet who stands faithful in the middle of Babylon? Or Isaiah, who foretells so many of the things coming in Jesus? Why Moses and Elijah in particular? Well, there are a lot of theories about this. One of the common understandings, one of the common ideas, is that these 2 represent the law and the prophets. They're kind of the kind of describing categories for the 2 big parts of Israel's sacred writings. Moses, the one who the law comes through, standing for that. Elijah, one of the key prophets, standing for that. And then if you see the law and the prophets, the kind of Old Testament scriptures, interacting with Jesus, the gospel, the New Testament scripture, speaking with one another in concert, that helps us think about how the whole Bible is united and together and not opposed, but the Old Testament testifies to and speaks to the Jesus who is coming. It's an attractive idea, isn't it? So theologically attractive that you almost have to say yes to it. And a lot of the early key leaders in the church, that was the way that they understood this. But it is a bit uncertain, because Elijah wasn't actually one of the writing prophets. He didn't write anything down. Stories are written down about him. He's not the most obvious choice for that. So I think it's probably because these 2 are the bookends of the Jewish hope for a Messiah, for a Savior, for a promised deliverer. See, Moses points forward. He says there's going to be a prophet who comes, a prophet like me, and you're to listen to him. Somebody God's people have to wait for and then listen to. And Elijah, well, Elijah is expected to show up again right before the day of the Lord, this kind of moment when God calls time on everything, when God says it's time to draw things to a close. And both of these ideas, somebody who arrives who you have to listen to, well, that was echoed in our passage, if you remember from the reading. And an Elijah who must come first, well, that was echoed in our reading as well. So I quite like that understanding of it myself. But I tell you what, it's not critical that we understand exactly why it's these two characters, because it's not explained. We're never told. That's not the main point our author wants to make from this passage. The main point, the emphasis here, unquestionably, is on the words of the Father coming from the bright cloud. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them. A voice from the cloud says, "This is my son, who I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him." Now, why do I say that is the voice of God the Father? Because, well, an extraordinary cloud is repeatedly how people experience the presence of God in the Bible. For example, in Moses' story, well, there's a cloud on the mountaintop where he speaks to God. Here it is for you, déjà vu. There's also the cloud over the tabernacle in the wilderness. There's the cloud filling Solomon's temple at its dedication, if you know the stories of the first part of the Bible. So pretty confident this is God the Father speaking. And God the Father speaks over Jesus. And he's not speaking for Jesus's benefit. You can see it's addressed to the disciples. What does he want them to know? Well, he wants them to know Jesus is the one and only Son. Jesus is profoundly loved. Jesus is fully pleasing to his Father. Now, if you've got good memory, you might remember God has actually spoken exactly these words, exactly the same words over Jesus already, way back at the start of our gospel story at Jesus' baptism, back in Matthew chapter 3. Here it is for you. As it turns out, these are actually the only words we hear direct from the Father in the whole gospel. And they're words that are repeated for us. Now, how is that for bold, underlined, 124-point font, right? If there's one thing we need to get, one thing the Father wants to tell us, well, this is what it is. Jesus is his Son. Jesus is the loved one. Jesus is the pleasing one. But this second time the Father repeats himself, says the same things about how he feels about his Son, what the identity is of his Son. He adds one thing. He adds a command, what they are to do in response to that. They are to listen to him. The one command delivered directly by the Father. Jesus has all authority. If you've been with us for a while, perhaps you'll remember our theme song, All Authority. Jesus has all authority, so we are to listen to him. And if it was the case that Moses and Elijah represent the law and the prophets, the first part of the Bible, well, notice the Father doesn't say listen to them. He says, listen to him. He's putting special emphasis and priority and focus on Jesus. Jesus is higher still than these greats of Israel's history. Jesus is higher still than these key leaders of the church who are there at the moment. Listen to him. But why does the Father need to give this command? Why does the Father make this command? Well, evidently, it's because those disciples are not listening to Jesus. Right? It's because they aren't listening. So then think about where we began. Think about the playlist idea. Think about this theme song of suffering and death. Well, did you notice you could hear exactly that same music in today's passage? If you look at verse 12, the Son of Man is going to suffer. The theme song is still there. The backing track is still there. Perhaps you'll remember what Peter, the disciple, had to say about those ideas if you were with us a few weeks back. Never, never, Lord. This shall never happen to you. Peter is not listening to Jesus. Right? Peter is absolutely not listening to Jesus. Peter wants different music on, thank you. He has a different vibe. He's got a different plan in mind for Jesus. And Peter is not alone in that, as we're going to see next week. We'll get to hear the voice of the rest of the disciples who haven't been up the mountain. When Jesus declares again that this suffering and death are ahead, what's their response? They're grieved. They're like, I do not like your musical taste, Jesus. This is not the tune I want to be hearing. The disciples are not listening, right? Jesus is plainly saying what is going to happen. He's plainly declaring God's plan for him, the path he's going to follow, and the disciples are not listening. But then we have to ask ourselves another question. Why are they not listening to Jesus? Why do they reject his plan? Why do they think this is a really bad idea? It's because they've got a different plan for Jesus. And they have a different plan fundamentally because they are set on solving a different problem. And this, I think, is where today's passage starts to come home for us, where it's easier for us to see what this has to say to us today. See, those disciples have not got their heads around the big problem, the real problem in their world. They think the real problem, well, it's out there. Right? They think the real problem's out there. It's this Romans crushing the God's people in their homeland, ruling over them in their own nation. It's these Pharisees and these Jewish religious leaders abusing their power to distort the way God should be worshipped. That's what they think the problem is. And Jesus suffering and dying is not going to do anything about that problem. They do not need him suffering and dying. They need him living, powerful, and winning. That's what they want him to do. He needs to go to Jerusalem not to suffer and die, but go to Jerusalem to whack 'em all, to roll up his sleeves and bring some lightning bolts. Let's sort this out, Jesus. We know what the solution is. Well, I think so often the truth is that we have the same thing in mind. We believe it's the same problem at bottom. What's really wrong in our world? Well, it's the government that's the problem, right? Whether it's Holyrood or Westminster's or Brussels or Davos. It's the big boss way above you in your company that's the problem, really. It's the super rich swanning around in their big jets. That's the problem, really. It's that mean teacher and their pedantic, excessive rules. That's the real problem. See, the problem is the crook and his crooked schemes. The problem is out there, right? The problem is other people. The problem is the world around us. And if we could just get those people out of the way, if we get them out of power, replace bad apples with good apples, it would all be solved. We'd all live happily ever after. Now, I think if we dig down inside our hearts, I think we will find that is most of what we would like to see God doing. Most of what we would like to see God working on and fixing in our world. Can you, God, go and fix all this bad stuff out there? Fix them. But that's not the true problem, so that's not the true solution. We have to listen to Jesus, like these disciples had to listen to Jesus. He has to go to Jerusalem. He has to suffer. He has to die. Why? Because that is the only way to solve our true and greatest problem. Now, I've used this quote before, but it's just so right for this. The line separating good and evil passes not through states or between classes or political parties either, but right through every human heart. The problem isn't just out there. The problem is in here too. And it's so much more serious than we dare imagine. You and me, we are not basically good. Pretty nice, only making the occasional slip up, but really it's nothing too serious. Nothing which really matters, nothing to get het up about. That's the way a lot of people would speak about themselves, if they don't think too much about it. But that is nonsense. The Bible tells us we are desperately broken. And I think we can see that if we're honest. You know what goes on in here, in your minds. You know what's inside your head. You know how far away inside your head is from always loving, always gracious, always righteous, always good, always kind. Maybe it doesn't slip out in you very much, but you know what's inside. You know how far away it's still there. The hard truth we need to grasp to understand Jesus' mood music, his backing track, is that this problem is deeply rooted within us. And it's desperately serious. And I think if we're honest, even if you're a Christian here today, it's hard to truly grasp, to truly believe that. These problems are so serious that the only solution to them is something so grave. That the problem in here, my wrong thoughts, my wrong attitudes, my wrong heart, is not just something we could sweep under the rug or overlook and not worry about. It's not something that I can will out of myself if I try a bit harder or train out of myself if I practice the right disciplines. But fundamentally, we have to listen to Jesus. We are broken to the core. It's going to take nothing less than the death of the Son of God to fix this. That is the only way. The only solution to this is our death. And Jesus will take that for us once we start to truly listen. Once we start to hear and take on board what Jesus has to say. Not only do we stop wanting him to change the music and put on a different song, but you can start to appreciate the music he's been playing, the stories he's been telling, the tone he's been setting. This music isn't tuneless, discordant noise like we thought it was. It's actually a love song, a beautiful love song. Remember what the Father underlined for us in his words over Jesus. What does he say about Jesus? He says, he is my son, my only son. He says he is my beloved son, uniquely loved by me, the Father. He says he is the pleasing son, not the displeasing son. He says he's number one, he's preeminent over all. And it is that Jesus who's going to lay down his life for us, obedient to the Father's will, all the way to death, even death on a cross. Why does God send the beloved? Why does Jesus go? Well, the answer is because God loves us. 1 John 3:16, this is exactly how we know what love is. This morning we're going to share bread and wine, and it's just so fitting. We're going to remember Jesus' body and blood given in our place at the cross. This is the story Jesus is playing the backing track for right now. It's the story he's telling his disciples if they would only listen. He is putting on the greatest love song ever. We see the love of God displayed. We see the heart of the gospel. But there's one more thing I want us to see this morning. Before we're done, Peter's suggestion of putting up 3 shelters. That's an odd thing on the surface, isn't it? You're like, Peter, did you actually pack any tents so you can put them up? Like, what are you planning on using on this mountaintop? Why do you think these people need you to do anything for them, Peter? Motor mouth ahead of brain. You can imagine the sign, days since Peter last mouthed off. It got to 6. Now it's back down to 0 again. But if you unpack this again, it's just another demonstration that Peter is not listening to Jesus. Peter is rejecting Jesus' plan. Jesus has already said what must happen next. I must go to Jerusalem. I must suffer. I must die. Peter says, why don't we stay on the mountain? Let's just stay on the mountain. It's like a shortcut. Snakes and ladders. I found the ladder to the end line, Jesus. We don't need to do that whole Jerusalem thing. Moses and Elijah are here. We're done. Let's make this the end game. I bet in hindsight, Peter is actually glad he was interrupted. He didn't have a chance to say something even more stupid. He and the others fall face down at the heavenly voice. They're terrified. The Bible tells us at the Father's words. Why are they terrified? They must feel like listen to him is an accusation, because it is. The implication is they were not listening to him. They have not listened to the only beloved Son of God, the exalted one, the authority over all. Of course they're afraid when they're being called on not listening to the one God has given all authority to. But what I want to show you is Jesus' gentle grace for his disciples. Even as they've misunderstood, as they've failed him, as they wanted to twist his route, ignore his plans, this is how the Lord deals with them. He comes to them, right? He touches them. He stands them back up. He takes away their fears. What a picture of grace. What a picture of the grace God extends towards us. See all the different parts here? He doesn't wait for them to come to him, crawl to him across the floor. He goes to them. Jesus comes first. He comes to us. He doesn't leave them wallowing in their fears and failures. He touches them. The beloved Son, the all-authority God himself physically reaches out and touches them, communicating the great truth of his incarnation. This God, the Lord of all, has made himself flesh and dwells among us to save. Then he calls them to stand back up. They don't need to stay face down under the weight of their failure and the shame that comes with it. They are to stand. And then he tells them they don't need to fear. Their failings have been forgiven. What a picture of Jesus' kindness towards these mistaken and failing disciples. What a picture of his gentleness. Can't you imagine this scene working out so differently? What a picture of his love. Now, do you know the same thing extends towards you? Gentleness, kindness, patience, and love. Jesus in his great love wants to come to you. He wants to touch you. He wants to stand you up again. He wants to tell you don't need to fear because your sins can be forgiven. Now that's good news. At Hope City, we always like to ask the question, so what? So we're going to ask our so what question this morning. We've heard what Jesus has to say. Well, so what? What does this mean for you or for me? Perhaps today the main thing you need to hear is this clear declaration by God that Jesus is not one among many. He's not just another key figure to mix into your collection of influencers, not just another flavor for your pick and mix. But listen to the Father. Jesus is the one. He is the Son, the beloved, the pleasing. The greatest figures from Israel's history just fade away next to Jesus. The greatest leaders in his church just fall face down next to Jesus. Jesus is the one above all. He has no equals, no rivals. And yeah, that is total anathema to our world's naive, all roads lead to God mantra. Many names, same God. That is Christianity's exclusiveness. It's offensive exclusiveness. But that's the Jesus of the Bible. If you want to know him, this is the Jesus that is revealed by the Bible. You can pretend he's someone else, but it's pretty clear. Perhaps for you, the big thing today is just this truth that the problem isn't just out there, but it's also in here. Our culture is very good at telling us you are a victim. You are not responsible. It's somebody else's fault. Maybe somebody thousands of years ago, maybe somebody in power, maybe somebody irresponsible or careless. And we can use that sort of language and that cultural vibe to camouflage this truth and blame everything on someone else, someone outside of our situation, our surroundings, like the child who throws the first punch, and when they're asked why, they're like, "He made me do it, miss." No. Christians believe that each and every one of us is profoundly broken, simply unable to do what is right, live right, think right, act out goodness. And that is the true reason that there's such a problem out there in our world, because all of us are broken. Not just a few bad apples, but every apple bad. Perhaps today is the day that you need to be honest with yourself and with God that you are not A-OK, that you are in fact part of the problem, not part of the solution. That you know you need to be different, that you're not what you wish you were. Well, that is a good place to be. Humble and on your face before God is a good place to be. It's hard to admit, but that is the attitude that lets us begin approaching God when we admit we have a problem. In love, then, he's going to offer us grace. Grace to the humble through Jesus suffering and dying in our place. He's going to promise us an ultimate path to having all that is wrong undone. In our world, out there, yes. In our hearts, in here, yes. The resurrection of Jesus is just the beginning. He is rooting out the rottenness in our hearts by his Spirit. And one day it is going to be done. Perhaps you're getting this. Perhaps today is the day you are ready to take a first humble step towards God. Well, come and speak to me afterwards. Or if you're with us online, hit the request prayer button. Speak to one of our team privately. If you're watching a recording, just send us an email. But take a step today. Take a step today. Or perhaps you've never really believed deep down that there is a God, a being, a person who actually loves you. Maybe you're a Christian even, but you still struggle to believe that God truly loves you. Fears, failings, warts, all. Maybe you've only ever pictured God as some kind of amorphous power, a great but distant thing with no interest in you. Or maybe you've only ever imagined the angry old man, furious whenever you mess up, ready to crush. But this is the truth in today's passage. God loves you personally, loves you enough that he will send his son, who he declares is beloved and pleasing to him. Why would he do that? Only because of love. Willingly into the furnace of suffering, willingly beyond that to death, even death in your place. That's the length he's willing to go to for you. That's how big, how strong his love is for you. So if that's where you are today, then maybe this is a good prayer to you. This is one of Jesus' first followers, the Apostle Paul, praying God would open our minds to how big, to how wide, long, deep, high the love of Christ is. Maybe that is what you should be praying about today. Or perhaps you've messed up again like Peter. Perhaps you've misunderstood God's plan. You thought it led somewhere else. You're trying to take the wheel and steer it your own way. Take a shortcut, perhaps. Well, I want you to see Jesus once more reaches out in grace and love. Those disciples were terrified, face down on the floor, total failures. They knew they'd not listened to Jesus in the way the Father requires, and yet this mighty, exalted Jesus at his moment of glorification, at this highest point, gently comes, physically touches, calls them back, tells them once more, do not be afraid. Maybe that is exactly what you need today. And that's exactly what Jesus stands ready to do if you will only ask. Jesus, come to me. Jesus, touch me. Jesus, lift me up. Jesus, take my fear. Let me know your love. Now maybe that is a good prayer for today. Now we're going to sing today in response. Maybe I can invite our band to come back up. If you're praying, please just keep praying. Maybe today you want to just sit and listen and think. Just do that. Maybe you need to stand and sing and declare what it is you believe. We have such a fitting song to close with today. We're going to sing about a son of suffering, holding these two things together. Jesus' beloved, exalted, perfect position with God and value to God, and his physical willingness to come to the cross and suffer in our place. So let's sing.